A man who was driving to his cabin to check on the snowfall would unfortunately get stuck in the snow. And as he starts having a mild heart attack, he sees something completely unexplainable. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. On February 24th, 1978, a man named Joseph Scone was driving to his cabin to check on the snowfall. Him and his family were going to be taking a weekend trip there to do some skiing. As he's driving in a remote area of Plymouth National Forest, on this high mountain road, it's just kind of a dirt road, Joseph would actually get his car stuck in the snow. So of course, he gets out and he's trying to get his car out, and then suddenly he realizes he's having a heart attack. So he turns the engine on, he's got the heat going. Obviously, it's freezing out, it's February, there's tons of snow. So he's just hoping that somebody comes by and is able to rescue him. About 6 hours later, as Joseph is lying in his car and he's having these really bad symptoms of a heart attack, he sees headlights. So he looks out and he sees a car parked behind him. The car headlights are on, so there's a group of people around this car, and he thinks that one of them is a woman with a baby. And that's quite strange because it's February, it's late at night, it's freezing. As Joseph began hollering for help, the headlights behind him shut off. Later, he would see more lights coming from behind him, and when he'd call out for help, the flashlights suddenly turned off. Eventually, Joseph's car would run out of gas, and he'd have to make an 8-mile walk down the snowy road to a lodge for help. Joseph would bring this information to the police when he watched a media report about 5 missing men, and these men would become known as the Yuba County Five, and it consisted of 5 friends: Bill Sterling, who was 29, Jack Hewitt, who was 24, Ted Wire, who was 32, Jack Madruga, who was 30, and Gary Mathis, who was 25. That evening, the 5 men had actually attended a basketball game at California State University, Chico, and this was the group's favorite pastime. They loved to go to basketball games, and when they weren't going to basketball games or watching basketball, they actually played on a team together. They actually played on a team called the Gateway Gators. This team was actually supported by a local program for people with mental disabilities. On February 25th, the Gators were actually due to play their first game ever, and the crew was incredibly excited about this. So they thought they'd celebrate by going to a basketball game the night before. I'm going to start with a little background about the 5 men because I think it's really important to know a little bit about each of them. So the group of men actually meant in this day program for mentally handicapped adults. Both Jack and Gary had actually served in the Army, and they both had their driver's license. Ted was employed at a snack bar as a janitor, but apparently because of his slowness, it started to cause problems, so his family really wanted him to quit, and he did. Ted's best friend was Jackie Hewitt, and Ted always looked after Jackie. Jackie really hated making phone calls, so Ted would actually do it for him oftentimes. He would even dial the number for him. Jack Madruga was a high school graduate and an Army veteran. He was a busboy for a while before being laid off. Gary Mathis was actually a diagnosed schizophrenic. And I just want to say that often the media portrays people with schizophrenia as dangerous or violent, and often that's really not the case. There are incidents of people with schizophrenia being violent, of course, but that's not the vast majority of people with this mental illness. With this diagnosis, Gary was actually discharged from the Army, and he very much relied on 2 medications to help treat him. Unfortunately, he had become violent on occasion, and that led to 2 arrests for assault. When he failed to take his medication, oftentimes this would land him in the Veterans Hospital. But Gary was being treated as an outpatient, and his doctors felt like he was a success case due to the medications and how well they were working for him. Bill Sterling was actually quite a character as well. He was deeply religious. He would spend hours at the library reading literature to bring Jesus to mental health patients in mental hospitals. Sterling and Hewitt had slight intellectual disabilities, while Jack Madruga and Ted were considered slow learners. Due to their special needs, all 5 men actually lived with their parents, and their families would start calling the group of men the boys. It was an endearing term because they were always together, they were always doing something. So Bill, Ted, Jack, and Jackie had actually known each other for 4 years. Gary was newer to the group. He'd only been hanging out with them for about a year at this point. Jack Madruga had his driver's license, so he would be doing the driving, and he actually loved his car. It was his prized possession. It was a turquoise and white Mercury Montego, and his family said he was very cautious with it, and he was very protective, and obviously he wouldn't let anybody else drive it. It was his baby. So on that Friday, February 24th, as I said, the men were getting ready to go to this basketball game, and they were super excited, but they were also very excited for their own game the next day. Many of them had actually laid out their uniforms on the bed that night to make sure everything was ready for the big day. So the men would have to drive 50 miles north of Yuba, which was where they were living, to Chico to attend this basketball game. The game would end around 10 p.m., and about 3 blocks away, the men stopped at a market. The men bought snacks and soda and some milk, and the cashier actually remembered seeing them because she was a bit annoyed that it was 10 p.m. and they were trying to close, and then this large group of people comes in. After this, the men just seemed to vanish. Many of their parents stayed awake waiting for them to get home. It was an hour-long drive from the university to their home, about 50 miles, so of course they wanted to make sure they got back safely. So obviously when these men don't arrive home when they're supposed to, family actually starts making calls to each other, and they soon realize that none of these men have returned home. Eventually, the families would call police and multiple missing person cases would be open. The group of men were very excited for their game the following day. Ted even said to his mother, "We got a big game Saturday. Don't you let me oversleep." On Tuesday, February 28th, a forest ranger would find Jack Madruga's car. Unfortunately, none of the men were in it. And what's even stranger is the car was located 2.5 hours away from Chico State and in the opposite direction of the route they were supposed to be taking that night to get back home. And even more concerning, it was in the mountains of Plumas National Forest. And this case just gets more eerie. As I said earlier, Jack loved his car and he didn't let it out of his sight, and he certainly wouldn't leave it in any strange conditions. But when the police found the car, they noticed that one of the windows was down and the car was unlocked, but there was no keys in the car. There were candy wrappers and milk cartons left in the car, but still no men. There was still gas in the tank. There was like a quarter tank of gas left, and there was no damage done to the car. Investigators did find this quite strange because the road was just a dirt road, unpaved. It was hard to navigate, so you would really need to know what you were doing to get up that road. So investigators figured that whoever was driving the car that night knew the road quite well. The car wasn't stuck in the snow. They were able to remove it from where it was very easily. Apparently the tires had spun, but the car wasn't stuck. It could have easily been removed from where it was if they needed to. And apparently there were 4 maps in the car. They were folded neatly and placed in the glove compartment. So obviously I mentioned that the keys were gone, so police decided to actually hotwire the car to see if it was working, and it started up immediately. So there was no dents or dings. There was nothing wrong with the car. It wasn't even really stuck. They would later determine that the car's underside was not damaged at all. The car had a low muffler. It had 5 people in it. So whoever was driving knew where they were going, and they knew that road well. And because Jack was driving and it was his car, the family said, first of all, he hates the cold. He doesn't like camping. He's never been on this road. There would be no reason for him to go there. And the rest of the families would say the same thing. There's no reason for any of them to be there. They don't know the road. They wouldn't know where they're going. They don't like to hunt or camp or fish. There's just absolutely no reason for any of them to be there. And although the car was found, nobody found anything else. There was no sign of the men. They couldn't find any clothing or any indication of where the men might be. That is, until a motorcyclist found himself in a deserted Forest Service trailer camp at the end of the road, and he smelled something really nauseating. Unfortunately, this would be the body of Ted. In this trailer, Ted was stretched out, laying on a bed, and he had 8 sheets pulled over his body and tucked around his head. His leather shoes were not on him, and they seemed to be missing. A table by the bed had his ring, which was engraved with his name, Ted, his gold necklace, his wallet with cash still inside, a gold watch, but its crystal had been missing. But the families of the 5 men would say that gold watch didn't belong to any of them. So when Ted went missing, he was actually about 5'11" and 200 pounds. But when his body was found, he lost between 80 and 100 pounds. His feet were badly frostbitten, and because of the growth of his beard, police estimated that he had been in that trailer between 8 and 13 weeks, slowly starving to death. He was about 19 miles from his car, which meant he had to walk through almost 20 miles of really thick and dense snow. Ted had broken into the trailer by a window. So apparently inside the trailer there was matchbooks full of matches, there was paper novels, there was wood furniture, all things that could be used to build a fire. They found about a dozen C ration cans opened and eaten, and one of them had actually been opened by an Army P-38 can opener. And as you can see, this isn't a common can opener. If I were to be given this and I was in the Army, I don't think I would know what to do with it. So only Jack Madruga and Gary Mathis would know how to use that can opener. They had both served in the Army. There was an outside storage shed, and apparently inside that storage shed was a bunch of food and a locker. Inside that locker were enough meals to keep keep the 5 men fed for at least a year, but that locker hadn't been opened. In another shed, there was a propane tank, and if they had turned on that propane tank, they'd have gas and they'd have heat. In the beginning of the video, I mentioned a man named Joseph, and it's believed on that night that Joseph saw these 5 men. They were in this car, there was a woman with a baby. He was positive that they had been there. Doctors would confirm that he had a heart attack. He had also mentioned a truck parking about 20 feet behind him briefly, but of course he didn't know if that was real or not because he was in severe pain. He could have just been seeing things. He basically said the truck would stop, it was about 20 feet behind him, and then it would eventually continue on down the road. He didn't know if that really happened. He could have been delirious. I think that's an important tip because the next sighting is actually really interesting. So 30 miles from where the car had been abandoned, a woman working at a store claimed to see the men. After seeing a flyer with the 5 men's faces on it, this woman contacted police and she said, hey, these men were actually at my market. She said 4 of them had actually stopped. They were in a red truck. And that was 2 days after their disappearance. And apparently the store owner corroborated her events. She identified Jack Hewitt and Bill Sterling. She said they were outside in the telephone booth and the others came inside. The store owner said he believed that Ted and Jack Hewitt came in, they purchased food, burritos, chocolate, milk, and soft drinks. And Ted's brother would actually go on to say that although all of this seemed out of character for Ted and the rest of the men, the description of the 2 men's behavior was consistent with Ted. He would say that Ted would eat anything he could get his hands on, and he was always with Jack Hewitt more than the other 4, so it would be more likely that him and Jack went into the store together. So the day after Ted was discovered, searchers would find Jack Madruga's body and Bill Sterling. They lay on opposite sides of the road to the trailer. It was about 11.4 miles from the car. Jack Madruga had partially been eaten by animals and dragged about 10 feet to a stream. He was lying face up when they found him, and he was still clutching his watch in one of his hands. Bill Sterling was found in a wooded area and he had been scattered, presumably by animals. And then 2 days later, Jackie Hewitt's father joined the search. Although people tried to talk him out of it, he really wanted to look for his son. People were concerned that they were going to find Jackie Hewitt, but not alive. And unfortunately, that's what happened. Unfortunately, Jackie Hewitt's father actually found his backbone. There were some other bones around, along with his pants and shoes. Jackie Hewitt's remains had been found northeast of the trailer, just like Bill's and Madruga's. And northwest of the trailer, about a quarter mile away, searchers found 3 Wolf Forest Service blankets and a 2-cell flashlight lying by the side of the road. The flashlight had been slightly rusted, but it was turned off, and obviously they couldn't tell how long it had been there. But there was no sign of Gary. They did find his tennis shoes inside the trailer, and they believe that he actually put on Ted's shoes because they were bigger, and Gary might have had frostbite at this point, requiring a bigger pair of shoes. So obviously Gary had to take medication. He wasn't getting his medication. They would give his picture to many mental health hospitals in the state to make sure that if he went to a mental health hospital to get his medication, that obviously the hospital contact police. So apparently on February 23rd, Forest Service Snowcat ran up the road to the trailer, which meant it left a very tightly packed path of snow to the trailer. And many believe that the boys followed that path all the way to the trailer. So there are a couple important things here. Next to Ted's body was a watch that apparently none of the men owned. And it was also later determined that Gary had friends in that area. An article would go on to say that they discovered that Gary made this new people in Forbestown, which is about halfway between Chico and Yuba cities, on a road with a turnoff so easy to miss that anybody driving it late at night might have ended up heading north towards the mountains and lost. But all this still led to more questions than answers. Why did they abandon a car that was working and could easily be pushed out of the snow? When they got into the trailer, why didn't they start a fire or turn on the gas or the heat? Why did they drive up there in the first place? And who was driving? Some people theorized that they were chased. But if they were being chased, how was the car undamaged? It would take a very skillful driver. Joseph claimed to hear some whistling noises and people talking. Who was whistling? Why did nobody help him when he was having a heart attack and he heard these people? Jack Madruga's mother, Mabel, would go on to say that there was some force that made him go up there. They wouldn't have fled off in the woods like a bunch of quail. We know good and well that somebody made them do it. We can't visualize someone getting the upper hand on those 5 men, but we know it must have been. Ted's sister-in-law would say, they seen something at the game at the parking lot. They might have seen it and didn't even realize they seen it. A family member for Gary would say, I can't understand why Gary would have been that scared. Even a fire, all those paperbacks, and they didn't even build a lousy fire. I can't understand why they didn't do that unless they were afraid. So a lot of people question why the goods in the cabin weren't used. There was enough food to feed them all. But Ted's mom would say this really wasn't abnormal for her son. She said that his disability greatly impacted his common sense. Apparently, he would question why he would have to stop at a stop sign. And one night, he had to actually be dragged out of his bed while his ceiling was on fire. The house he was living in was on fire. And he wouldn't get out of bed because he was worried about missing work the next day. His family had to drag him out of bed. And many wonder why Ted was alone in the trailer. So I believe that perhaps when Ted died, the other men realized that they needed to leave and go to civilization. They needed to get help. So maybe they went one at a time. Maybe they all went at once in different directions. I don't know, but they were located outside of the trailer, so perhaps they had wanted to get help. There's also another theory that Gary Mathis is to blame for all this, that he actually set the men up to die. So apparently 3 newspapers collaborated together and they realized quite a bit about Gary. And they believe that Gary wasn't as harmless as he was made out to be. These files, clips, and interviews shape a disturbing image of Mathis. Billed in virtually all media reports at the time as another lost lamb caught out in the cold, Mathis was a aberration within the flock, a young man who did not belong with the others. He was violently schizophrenic and had a history of drug use and wasn't intellectually disabled like the others. Apparently, one time when Gary was put in jail on base while he was in the army, he actually punched a guard. He would tell an investigator, quote, "I've been in the army and I don't like it, and I thought if I hit a cop, maybe they'd let me out." Apparently, Gary would also break out of facilities and take very long walks. Eventually, he would live with his grandmother in Oregon, but his mother wanted him to come home. Apparently, he showed up a few weeks later and he was very dirty, and he basically claimed that he walked from Portland, which was like a 540-mile walk. He said he stole milk off of porches and ate dog food to survive. Of course, that can't be verified, but that is what he said. Apparently, a few weeks before he returned back home, he did have another violent incident. He broke into the home of a local couple, and the couple awoke to find Mathis standing in their bedroom. He told them that he was looking for a ring to return to Satan and that they also owed him rent money because the house was his. Apparently, after that, he went home, he got help for his schizophrenia, he was taking medication, and life got better. This newspaper would also go on to say that following a 1978 interview with Mathis' longtime acquaintance Janet Ensra, Yuba County Sergeant James Black wrote that Mathis had repeatedly told Janet of a dream where he and several other people would disappear. Janet called Mathis a very violent person, hurting several men seriously, and said that he also hates women. And apparently, the Gateway Gators basketball coach would tell police that although Gary was medicated, he still felt like he could flip out at any point. And apparently, the other boys' parents weren't very comfortable with Gary Mathis. Jack Beecham would say they didn't seem to know about his criminal record. He was a stronger personality, the only one among them who would fight back if threatened. Of the 5 missing boys, the case file said, he would be the most likely to lead and suggest places to go or things to do. I know parents at the time told us, they told me personally, that they had deep concerns about Gary being involved in this. They were unabashed in their opinion and telling me that. Go on to say that basically he believes that Gary did set them up. He didn't pull the trigger or do anything like that, but he wanted them to die. He basically said that's the only thing that makes sense. Ted's brother would also talk about the fact that the show Unsolved Mysteries had contacted the families because they wanted to do an episode on the missing 5, to drum up leads to see if they could actually solve the case. And every single family agreed except Gary's family. And Gary was still missing at this point. And apparently Gary's surviving siblings would not do any interviews. They just declined to comment on the entire thing. Ted's brother would say, "That's just suspicious. I'm not saying they knew, but well, you can probably guess what I think." And to wrap up this case, there was one final, very mysterious and eerie phone call. About 3 weeks after the boys went missing, Debbie Lynn Reese would get a phone call. And she's a Yuba City woman. She got a phone call at home and she answers. She would say, "Hello." And the person on the other end would say, "I know where the missing 5 men are." And then he would hang up. And then the next day, this man called back. The man would say, "I need help because I really hurt those guys bad." He would say, "Who did you hurt?" He replied, "Don't play dumb with me," and hung up. On the day after that, March 17th, she would get one final call. Caller would say, "Those 5 guys are all dead." "They're all dead," she said. "They're all dead," he repeated. I would love to hear your guys' theories on this case. I feel like this case is just overwhelming. There's just so much that doesn't add up. We see Joseph, who gets stuck in the snow and he can't get his car out. He starts having a heart attack and there's people there, but he can't seem to get their attention. And he thinks it's men and a woman and a baby. That's pretty strange. He would later recall that he thinks a truck pulled up. And then that woman at the store would say, "Oh yeah, a red truck came and 4 men were in it." There's also a watch found that didn't belong to any of the men. Of course, that could have been there when they arrived, but we don't know. I'm not entirely sure what I believe. I just feel like there's a lot of strange things. The fact that they didn't get into the food and, eat until somebody found them, I guess is strange, but in the context, like Ted's mother said, it isn't strange. I mean, he was laying in his bed and the ceiling is on fire and he's not getting up because he doesn't want to be late for work. So obviously he did lack common sense to no fault of his own. So maybe he didn't understand that he could eat it and that he had to eat it to survive. My number one question is, why did they go there? Why they went up that really rough, snowy mountain? I feel like we'd have the answer to this. I feel like that's the largest question of this case. Why did they drive up there in the first place? Did they get lost on their way home? Was somebody following them? What happened to get them to where they were? I would love to know your thoughts on the case, so pop it in the comments below. So if I missed something, be sure to pop it in the comments below. I would love to know because this might help me rationalize and try to figure it out as everybody else is trying to do. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments below and I'll get to as many as possible. Check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you next time.